The sun had just begun to set when Andrea Thompson pulled into the circular driveway of her beautiful two-story colonial home. She'd spent another exhausting day at her tech startup, where she served as CEO and founder. The autumn leaves crunched under her car's tires as she parked, and the golden hour light cast long shadows across her well-maintained lawn. After gathering her laptop bag and a stack of documents she needed to review before tomorrow's investor meeting, Andrea noticed a police cruiser slowly driving past her house. She didn't think much of it at first. Their suburban neighborhood was generally quiet and safe, with regular police patrols. But as she walked toward her front door, fumbling with her keys, the cruiser made a U-turn and pulled into her driveway, its headlights illuminating her back. The sharp chirp of the police siren made her jump slightly. Through her rearview mirror, she watched as an officer stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his belt as he approached. His hand rested casually near his holster, a detail that didn't escape Andrea's notice. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer called out, his flashlight beam dancing across her face. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" Andrea took a deep breath, her heart beginning to race despite her outward calm. She'd heard stories like this from friends and colleagues, but had never experienced it herself. "I live here," she replied evenly, maintaining eye contact with the officer. "This is my home." The officer's skeptical expression was visible even in the growing darkness. "Is that right?" he said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. "Could I see some identification, please?" As Andrea reached for her purse, her neighbor Mrs. Chen peeked out from behind her curtains across the street. The elderly woman had welcomed Andrea and her family to the neighborhood with homemade dumplings when they'd moved in 3 years ago. Now she watched the scene unfolding with visible concern. "Here's my driver's license," Andrea said, handing over her ID. "As you can see, this address is listed as my residence." The officer studied the license carefully, then looked back at the house, then at Andrea again. His doubtful expression remained unchanged. "And how long have you been working here?" The implication wasn't lost on Andrea. Despite her tailored business suit and designer briefcase, he'd automatically assumed she was household staff. She felt a familiar mixture of frustration and weariness settle in her chest, but kept her voice steady. "Officer," she said firmly, "I don't work here. I own this house. I purchased it 3 years ago. Would you like to see the deed? Or perhaps the family photos in the living room? Or maybe you prefer to watch the security footage from my doorbell camera showing me entering and leaving my own home every day." The mounting tension was interrupted by the sound of another car pulling into the driveway. It was Andrea's husband Robert, returning from picking up their kids from after-school activities. He was a respected cardiothoracic surgeon at the local hospital, and the look of concern on his face was evident as he assessed the situation. Their 12-year-old daughter and 9-year-old son watched wide-eyed from the back seat as their mother stood in the driveway, still holding her work bags, facing down a police officer who seemed to doubt her right to be there. The officer's demeanor shifted slightly as Robert stepped out of the car. Andrea could see the moment when realization began to dawn on the officer's face, the realization that he had made incorrect assumptions based solely on appearance. The security lights around the house had clicked on automatically as darkness fell, illuminating the scene in harsh clarity. Mrs. Chen had now come out onto her porch, phone in hand, ready to intervene if needed. Other neighbors had begun to notice the commotion, creating an audience for this unfortunately common type of encounter. The silence that hung in the air was heavy as Robert walked toward his wife and the officer. With over 15 years of experience handling tense situations in the operating room, he approached calmly, his hands visible at his sides. "Good evening, officer," Robert said, his voice measured and professional. "Is there something we can help you with?" The kids remained in the car, their faces pressed against the window, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of confusion and worry. The officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing between Andrea and Robert. "We received reports of suspicious activity in the area," he repeated, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. "Just doing my duty to check things out." "I understand," Robert replied, "but my wife has already shown you her ID confirming this is our home. Is there something else you need to verify?" Andrea noticed how her daughter had shrunk down in her seat, trying to make herself invisible. A sight that made her heart ache. This wasn't the first time their children had witnessed such an interaction, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. Mrs. Chen, still watching from her porch, called out, "Andre, Robert, is everything okay? Do you need me to come over?" Her concern was evident in her voice, and it seemed to add another layer of discomfort to the officer's demeanor. "We're fine, Mrs. Chen," Andrea called back, managing a small smile. "Just a misunderstanding." She turned back to the officer. "Would you like to come inside and see our family photos? Or perhaps check the security system that shows us coming and going each day?" The officer cleared his throat, finally lowering his flashlight. "That won't be necessary, ma'am. I apologize for any inconvenience." His words came out stiffly, like they were being pulled from him. Robert placed a gentle hand on Andrew's shoulder. "Kids, you can come out now," he called to their children. "Everything's fine." Their daughter Grace slowly emerged from the car, clutching her volleyball gear close to her chest. Their son David followed, his karate uniform still on from practice. They moved cautiously, staying close to their father's side. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" David whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The innocent question seemed to pierce through the tension, making the officer visibly flinch. "No, sweetheart," Andrea assured him, running her hand over his hair. "No one's in trouble. The officer was just doing his job, making sure our neighborhood is safe." More neighbors had gathered now, watching from their driveways and windows. The Pattles from next door stood at their mailbox, pretending to check their mail in the dark. The Wilsons across the street had their porch light on, their silhouettes visible through their screen door. The officer took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the growing audience. "Well, everything seems to be in order here," he said, trying to maintain his professional demeanor. "You folks have a good evening." As he turned to leave, Andre spoke up. "Officer," she called, causing him to pause. "I hope this experience helps you think twice before making assumptions about who belongs where. This neighborhood is diverse, and we all look out for each other here." The officer nodded stiffly before returning to his cruiser. As his taillights disappeared down the street, the tension began to dissolve, replaced by a familiar wariness. Mrs. Chen crossed the street, bringing with her a container of fresh-baked cookies she'd made that afternoon. "Children," she called out warmly, "I think you both deserve a treat after being so brave." The kids' faces lit up, momentarily forgetting the uncomfortable scene they'd just witnessed. But Andrea and Robert exchanged a knowing look. They would need to have another conversation with their children tonight about what had happened and why. As they all headed inside, neighbors began to disperse, some offering supportive waves or nods. The Pattles called out an invitation for weekend brunch, their way of showing solidarity. The Wilsons sent a quick text asking if they needed anything. Inside their home, surrounded by family photos and the warmth of their usual evening routine, Andrea took a moment to breathe. These moments were exhausting, but they also reinforced the importance of standing firm, staying composed, and showing their children how to handle such situations with dignity. Later that evening, after the kids had finished their homework and were getting ready for bed, Andrea sat at the kitchen island, still in her work clothes, staring into a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The events of the evening kept replaying in her mind, not because they were shocking, but because they were so frustratingly familiar. Robert finished loading the dishwasher and pulled up a stool beside her. "You're thinking about talking to the police department, aren't you?" he asked, knowing his wife's determination to turn difficult moments into opportunities for change. "Actually, I'm thinking bigger than that," Andrea replied, pulling out her laptop. "Remember that community outreach program I mentioned starting through the company? I think it's time to make it happen." Their daughter Grace appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing her favorite space-themed pajamas. "Mom, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked hesitantly. "Of course, sweetie. Come here." Andrea patted the stool next to her. Grace climbed up, playing with the end of her braided hair, a nervous habit she'd had since kindergarten. At school, Jenny asked why police always stop black people more than others. Grace said quietly, "I didn't know what to say." "And after tonight?" Her voice trailed off. Andre and Robert exchanged glances. These conversations never got easier, but they'd always promised to be honest with their children while giving them hope for change. "It's complicated, honey," Andre began, choosing her words carefully. Some people make wrong assumptions about others based on how they look, but that's why it's so important to speak up and work to change things. Robert added, "Remember how your science fair project showed that plants grow better when they have different types of soil? People are kind of like that too. We're all better when we appreciate our differences instead of being scared of them." A small smile appeared on Grace's face, like Mrs. Chen's dumplings and Mrs. Patel's samosas at the block party. "Exactly," Andrea laughed, hugging her daughter. "And speaking of making things better, would you like to help me with a special project?" Grace's eyes lit up. She'd inherited her mother's passion for problem-solving and her father's gentle persistence. What kind of project? Andrea opened her laptop, showing Grace a rough draft of an idea she'd been developing. "I'm thinking about starting a program where people from different backgrounds, like police officers, business owners, doctors, teachers, can come together and really get to know each other. Not just quick hellos, but real conversations. Like when David's friend Tom didn't want to try my birthday cake because it looked different, but then he loved it after he actually tasted it," Grace asked, referring to the special Caribbean black cake Andre's grandmother had taught her to make. "That's a perfect example," Robert said proudly. "Sometimes people just need a chance to learn about each other." Their son David appeared, clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. "Are we having a family meeting without me?" he asked, looking wounded. "Never," Andre smiled, lifting him onto her lap. "We're planning something special, and we need your ideas too." As their children brainstormed ideas, everything from neighborhood food festivals to joint family picnics, Andrea felt her earlier frustration beginning to transform into determination. The incident in their driveway hadn't just been about one officer's assumptions, it was about the larger need for understanding and connection in their community. Mrs. Chen's cookies sat in their decorative tin on the counter, a reminder of how simple acts of kindness could bridge divides. The Patels had texted again, offering to help with any community initiatives Andre might be planning. Even the Wilsons, who'd lived on the street for 30 years, had shared stories about how the neighborhood had changed for the better as it became more diverse. "Mom," David said suddenly, "can we invite Officer Mike to our next block party? He always waves to us at school crossing, and maybe he could tell other police officers that we're all just regular people." Andrea hugged her son tighter, touched by his innocent wisdom. "That's actually a brilliant idea, sweetheart. Sometimes the best way to change things is to start right where we are." The next morning, Andrea arrived at her tech company's headquarters earlier than usual. The events from the previous evening had sparked something in her, not just anger or frustration, but a real drive to create meaningful change. She sat at her desk, looking out over the city skyline, and began drafting her plan. Her assistant knocked on the door, bringing in her morning coffee. "You're here early," she noted, then noticed Andrea's intense focus. "Is this about what happened last night? Mrs. Chen called me this morning. News travels fast in the neighborhood." Andre smiled, grateful for her tight-knit community. "Actually, yes. Remember that community outreach program we discussed in last month's board meeting? I think it's time we put it into action." She pulled up her presentation from the previous month and began making adjustments. Her company had resources, influence, and most importantly, a diverse workforce that could help bridge gaps in understanding. As she worked, she received a text from Robert. "The kids told their teachers about your community project idea. The school wants to get involved." By mid-morning, Andre had scheduled a meeting with her leadership team. As they filed into the conference room, she could see genuine interest in their faces. Many of them had their own stories, their own experiences that echoed what had happened in her driveway. "Yesterday," Andrea began, standing at the front of the room, "I was reminded that change doesn't just happen in big moments. It happens in driveways, at block parties, and in conference rooms like this one." She clicked through her presentation, outlining a program that would bring together local law enforcement, business leaders, educators, and community members. Not for formal lectures or rigid training sessions, but for real conversations over shared meals, family activities, and community events. "We're not just a tech company," she continued. "We're part of this community, and we have the power to create spaces where people can learn to see each other as human beings first." Her team's response was overwhelmingly positive. The head of HR suggested involving their employee resource groups. The marketing director offered to document the initiative to inspire other companies. Even the usually quiet head of engineering spoke up about similar programs he'd seen work in other cities. During lunch, Andre received another surprise. The police chief had called the company's public relations department, having heard about the incident and Andre's proposed community initiative. Instead of being defensive, he expressed interest in collaboration. Back in her office, Andre organized her thoughts. This wasn't just about one encounter with one officer anymore. It was about creating lasting change in how people saw and treated each other. She thought about her children, about how they'd processed the previous night's events with such openness and hope. Her phone buzzed with messages from neighbors. Mrs. Chen had already started planning the menu for the first community dinner. The Pantels offered their large backyard as a meeting space. The Wilsons, who had connections with the local newspaper, wanted to help spread the word. Andre's assistant poked her head in again. The school principal is on line 1. Something about incorporating community awareness into their curriculum. As she picked up the phone, Andre caught her reflection in the window. She saw not just a successful tech CEO or a woman who'd faced discrimination, but someone who could help build bridges between different parts of her community. The principal was enthusiastic. "Your daughter mentioned your idea in her social studies class today," she explained. "It got us thinking about how we could help our students understand and appreciate differences from an early age." They discussed possibilities, student-led diversity projects, joint activities with other schools from different neighborhoods, parent-teacher workshops on inclusion. Each idea built on the next, creating a web of connections and understanding that could extend far beyond the school walls. By late afternoon, what had started as a response to an unsettling encounter was growing into something much bigger. Andre's calendar was filling up with meetings, community leaders, police representatives, education administrators, and local business owners, all interested in being part of the change. 2 weeks after the driveway incident, Andre stood in her company's largest conference room, amazed at the turnout for the first community bridge-building meeting. The room was packed with faces from every corner of their community, police officers in uniform, teachers from local schools, business owners, and families from various neighborhoods. "I never expected this many people," Robert whispered, standing beside her with a stack of name tags. Their children were helping to greet people at the door, proudly wearing special junior community leader badges they'd made themselves. The police chief had arrived early, and to everyone's surprise, so had the officer from that night 2 weeks ago. He stood quietly near the back, looking uncomfortable but determined to be there. Andre watched as Mrs. Chen approached him with her famous dumplings, somehow managing to get a small smile out of him. "Welcome, everyone," Andrea began, her voice steady and warm. "Look around this room. This is what community looks like. Not just people living near each other, but people willing to learn from each other." The first activity was simple but powerful. People were paired up with someone they'd never met before, someone from a different background or profession. They were given 10 minutes to find 3 things they had in common beyond the obvious. The room filled with conversation and occasional laughter. A tough-looking police sergeant discovered he shared a passion for gardening with a local shop owner. A young teacher found out she and an elderly neighbor had both competed in swimming championships. Andre's daughter Grace was deep in conversation with a police officer's teenage son, both of them excitedly discussing their favorite science fiction books. David had somehow convinced a group of adults to join him in demonstrating his latest karate moves. "You know what's amazing?" Robert said, watching the scene unfold. "Nobody's trying to be perfect. They're just trying to be real." The next part of the meeting involved small group discussions about community experiences. Andre had worried this might be too heavy, too soon, but the conversations flowed naturally. People shared stories of misunderstandings, prejudices they'd faced or recognized in themselves, and moments of unexpected connection. The officer from that night raised his hand during one discussion. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, he said, his voice quieter than anyone expected. "And sometimes we get so focused on looking for problems that we forget to see people. That night, I made assumptions I shouldn't have made." A silence fell over the room, not uncomfortable but thoughtful. Then Mrs. Chen spoke up from her corner. "We all make mistakes," she said gently. "The important thing is learning from them." The afternoon continued with practical planning sessions. The school principal proposed a monthly cultural exchange program. Local business owners offered to host community meet and greets. The police department suggested ride-along programs and open house events. Andrea watched as her children moved between groups, adding their own ideas with the uninhibited honesty of youth. Grace suggested a community cookbook with stories behind each recipe. David wanted to organize a neighborhood sports day where teams would be mixed up randomly. As the meeting drew to a close, people lingered, exchanging phone numbers and making plans. The police chief approached Andrea with a formal proposal for regular community dialogue sessions. "This isn't just about preventing incidents," he said. "It's about building something better." Mrs. Chen had somehow produced enough food to feed everyone, turning the end of the meeting into an impromptu potluck. The Patels added their samosas to the mix, and someone had brought a huge tray of brownies. "Mom," Grace typed at Andrea's sleeve, "Officer Mike wants to come to my science fair next week. He used to be a chemistry teacher before joining the police." The officer who'd stopped Andrea now stood chatting with Robert about their shared interest in classic cars. It wasn't forced or awkward anymore, just two people finding common ground. 1 month after the first community meeting, signs of change were becoming visible throughout the neighborhood. Andrea stood at her office window, reviewing a progress report that brought a smile to her face. What had started as a response to an uncomfortable encounter had grown into something much more meaningful. The local police department had implemented new training programs, with community members invited to share their experiences and perspectives. Officers were now regular visitors at neighborhood events, not just as authority figures, but as participants and friends. The officer from that night had become one of the most active participants, often bringing his family to community gatherings. At Grace's science fair, something unexpected happened. Her project about different cultural approaches to sustainable gardening had drawn quite a crowd. Police officers, teachers, and neighbors all gathered around as she explained how combining traditional growing methods from various cultures could create better results. The pride in her voice when she talked about Mrs. Chen's Chinese herbs growing alongside Mrs. Patel's Indian spices was impossible to miss. The community cookbook project had taken off beyond anyone's expectations. Each recipe came with a story, a memory, or a family tradition. Even the local newspaper had picked up the story, featuring photos of neighbors teaching each other their special dishes. The article's headline read, "Local Community Cooks Up Understanding." At her company, Andrea had implemented a new internship program partnering with local schools. Students from different backgrounds got hands-on experience in the tech industry while sharing their perspectives on making technology more inclusive and accessible to all communities. One afternoon, while reviewing the program's progress with her team, Andrea received an unexpected visit. The police chief and several officers had come to share some news. Their department had been recognized at the state level for their innovative community engagement program. But more importantly, they reported a significant improvement in police-community relations. "It's not just about statistics," the chief explained, sitting in Andrea's office. "It's about the stories we're hearing. Last week, one of our officers was helping a family change a flat tire. Turns out they were new to the area and worried about calling the police for help. Now they're coming to our community barbecue next weekend." Robert, who had taken a leadership role in organizing medical professionals to participate in community health fairs, shared similar stories. People who had once been hesitant to seek medical care were now comfortable asking questions and seeking help, thanks to the informal setting and familiar faces. David's karate instructor had started offering free self-defense classes that brought together people from all walks of life. The classes always ended with shared meals and conversations, breaking down barriers one interaction at a time. The Neighborhood Watch program had transformed too. Instead of being focused solely on reporting suspicious activity, it had become a network of neighbors looking out for each other. When the elderly couple down the street needed help with yard work, the whole community pitched in, turning it into a mini-block party. One evening, as Andrea drove home from work, she noticed something different. People were outside more, talking across fences, children playing together in front yards. The atmosphere had shifted from polite distance to genuine connection. Pulling into her driveway, the same one where this journey had begun, she saw Mrs. Chen teaching Grace how to fold dumplings on their front porch. The police officer who'd stopped her that night was there too, his daughter learning alongside Grace, all of them laughing at their misshapen attempts. Inside, she found Robert hosting a meeting of the Community Health Committee in their living room. David was proudly showing his latest karate moves to a mixed group of adults and children who applauded his efforts with genuine enthusiasm. That night, as the family sat down for dinner, Grace asked a question that made everyone pause. "Mom, remember when you were scared that night with the police officer? Now he's teaching me about his mom's recipes for the cookbook." 6 months after the driveway incident, Andre stood on a small stage in the community center, looking out at a room full of familiar faces. The local news stations had set up their cameras to cover what had become known as the Bridge Builder Initiative, a program that was now being adopted by neighboring cities. The results of their community efforts were clear in ways both big and small. Crime rates had dropped, but more importantly, trust had grown. Local businesses reported increased customer diversity. The school principal noted higher parent participation across all communities. Even the real estate agents mentioned how their neighborhood had become one of the most sought-after areas, specifically because of its strong community bonds. "When I faced discrimination in my own driveway," Andrea began her speech, "I had two choices. I could let anger take over, or I could use that moment to build something better. Standing here today, I see we made the right choice." She paused, watching her children in the front row. Grace was sitting between Mrs. Chen and the police officer's daughter, sharing a plate of cookies. David was teaching his karate moves to a group of younger kids from different backgrounds. "This isn't just about reducing misunderstandings between police and residents," she continued. "It's about creating a community where everyone feels they belong, where a child can look around and see role models who look like them and also learn from those who don't." The police chief stepped up next, sharing how the department had transformed. "Our officers now spend as much time playing basketball with kids and attending community events as they do patrolling," he said. "And you know what? They're better officers for it." The event showcased various success stories. A wall displayed photographs of community activities, cooking classes, sports events, cultural celebrations. Each picture told a story of barriers broken and friendships formed. Robert shared how the medical community outreach program had expanded to include mental health support and wellness workshops. Mrs. Chen demonstrated her famous dumpling-making technique, now a regular feature at community gatherings. The Patels spoke about how their small business had grown through community connections. But the most powerful moment came when the officer from that night took the stage. 6 months ago, I made a mistake based on assumptions," he admitted. "Today, I'm not just a better police officer, I'm a better neighbor, a better father, and a better person because this community gave me a chance to learn and grow." Grace's science project about cultural gardening had grown into a community garden where families grew vegetables together, sharing techniques from their various backgrounds. David's karate class had become a symbol of discipline and respect across cultural lines. As the event wound down, Andrea noticed small groups forming naturally. Police officers chatting with teenagers, elderly neighbors sharing stories with young families, business owners planning joint ventures. The awkwardness of those first meetings had given way to genuine friendship. Later that evening, as families lingered in the community center parking lot, Andrea overheard snippets of conversation that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Officers making dinner plans with residents, kids arranging playdates across cultural lines, neighbors discussing weekend plans and sharing family recipes. Walking home with her family, Andrea saw a police cruiser drive by. The officer waved warmly, and her children waved back without hesitation. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes about how far they'd come. "Mom," David said, holding her hand, "remember when you were upset that night? Look how many friends we made because of it." Grace added thoughtfully, "My teacher says sometimes the best things come from the hardest moments." She was right, wasn't she? Robert squeezed Andrea's shoulder. "You turned a moment of prejudice into a movement of progress," he said quietly. "That's something our kids will always remember." Standing in her driveway, the same spot where it all began, Andrea looked around at her neighborhood. Porch lights were on, families were outside enjoying the evening, and there was a sense of belonging that went beyond addresses and property lines. This wasn't just a happy ending to an unfortunate incident. It was the beginning of a new story, one that would continue to unfold with each new family that moved in, each community event, and each small interaction that showed how people could grow and change together. The story had come full circle, but its impact would ripple outward for years to come, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes start right in your own driveway.